Okay, welcome to Unit 3, Part 4 lectures. This is ITCO341 class. In this lecture, we are going to discuss about range, variance, and also standard deviation. So the measure of variation. Again, the main reason why we are looking for range and variance and standard deviation in a data set, it will tell us how the data are varying. Basically, the dispersion of the data set. For example, the higher the standard deviation means the data set range is very high. So we start with the range first. So how do we find the range? The range is the difference between the maximum and also the minimal data entry in the set. And the data must be quantitative. So this is the formula. We have the maximum data entry minus the minimal data entry. So we have an example here, and we have 10 graduates, and this is their starting salary in thousands. And here we want to find the range. So the range will be the maximum value and the minimum value, the difference. So here the maximum value is 47. The minimum value is 37. So we can see 47 minus 37 will give us 10. So the range will be 10,000. Again, range is the difference between the maximum data entry and the minimal data entry, the difference. So here we have 10 starting salary of graduates. We look at the minimum value and the maximum value, then we find the difference of the two. The next, we're going to discuss about deviation. Deviation normally is the difference between the data entry and the mean. So deviation means the difference of each data entry and the mean. So each data, how they deviate from the mean. Sometimes we may have a deviation value to be positive, which means the value is greater than the mean of the whole data entry. Or it will be negative, which means the mean of the data entry is greater than the value. So deviation again is X, which is our data entry, minus the mean, which is our population mean. Or if we are dealing with sample, same X, our data entry minus the sample mean, which is the X bar. So this is an example again given to us, the same example. We have 10 graduates, starting salary. Now, if I'm going to find a deviation, the first thing I have to look for is the mean of the data set. So I add all the values and I divide by 10. Why I'm dividing by 10? Because we have 10 data entry. To find the mean or average, we add all the data entry and divide it by the number of data entries we have. So this gives us 41.5. So the deviation will be 41 minus 41.5, 38 minus. So we're going to subtract the mean from each data entry. And that's what we have here. The data entry is 41. And we can see here the mean is 41.5. So we subtract 41.5 each from the data entry. Now, if you sum it, you get 0 because some of the data will be greater than the mean and some of the data entry will be less than the mean. So this is the reason why when we are looking for variance, we square the value. Again, we find the mean of the data entry, then we subtract the mean from each value. Now, if we don't square it, the answer will be 0. As we saw in the deviation, that will be 0. Now, when we square it, the goal of squaring it is to get rid of the negatives. Negative square will be positive. So finding the variance, it will be, the symbol is given here. And then the sum of the difference of each value and the mean all square divided by the total population. This uppercase N. Now to find the standard deviation, there need to be square root of the variance. So the difference of each value and the mean all square, we sum it divided by the population size, square root will give us the standard deviation. So this is finding the population variance and standard deviation in words. So the first thing we do always is to find the mean of the population data set. The same thing applies to sample also. We find the mean first. If we know the mean, which is the sum of all the values divided by the population size, we can find the deviation. As we saw earlier, deviation is what? Each value minus the mean. After that, we square the deviation, which we normally say square each deviation. The reason why, because the total deviation will be 0, because some of the value will be greater than the mean and some will be lesser than the mean, so they will cancel each other. So that's why we square the deviation. After that, we sum everything. Then we divide by the number of population we have or sample. This will give us variance now. So to find the standard deviation, we just find the square root of the variance. So finding the square root of the variance will give us the population standard deviation. So this is an example given to us. Again, this is the same example of a 10 starting salary of graduates. We were able to find the mean. The mean was 41.5. Or just add all the value divided by 10. So now we find the deviation for each value. Then what we do is that we square it so that we get rid of the negatives. So we can see that the sum square gives us 88.5, but deviation total will give us 0. Now, if we know the 88.5, we divide by the population size. In this case, is 10. So our standard deviation and the variance will give us 8.9. Now, square root of the variance will give us the standard deviation, which will be 3.0. So sample variance again, find the deviation and square it. Same as the population variance, but this time, instead of dividing by the size of the population, in this case, we divide by the size of the sample minus 1. Then we find the square root of the variance. That will give us the sample standard deviation. Now we can see the difference between the sample variance is n minus 1. Population variance will be n. So next, finding the sample variance and standard deviation, we find the mean, the same step as the population also. Find the mean of the sample data set, find the deviation, square the deviation, then we can find the sum square. Sum square means when we find the difference between each value and the mean, then we square it, that will give a square deviation. Then after we know the sum square, the next thing we divide by n minus 1, and that will give a standard, the sample variance. Then the solution we get, we find a square root, and that will give us the standard deviation. So this is another example, actually the same example again. We want to find the standard deviation, sample standard deviation. So we know the mean already. We subtract mean from each value, then we square the answer, then we find the sum square. Then sum square instead of over 10 is 10 minus 1. So standard deviation will give us 9.8. Again, we can see here, actually this is the variance, Variance, this means the difference of each value and the mean all square So we find all the value. This is sample. Then we divide by n minus 1. So we consider the sample standard deviation will be the square root of the variance. So it will be 88 square root of 9.8 or 88.5 over 9, and that gives us 3.1. So standard deviation is a measure of a typical amount an entry deviate from the mean. So standard deviation is the measure of a typical amount of an entry deviate from the mean. The more the entries are spread out, the greater the standard deviation. And the sample standard deviation for frequency distribution, here if we have more than one data set in the same category. So n can give a sum of f. So find the standard deviation for grouping data. So you can see here, each data repeat more than once. So it says, for example, 1, we have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So a lot of ones. Same thing apply to, etc. So what we do first is to construct frequency distribution. So here we know how many, for example, 2 is 7, 3 is 7, 4 is 2, 6 is 4, etc. So if that is the case, the first thing we look for is the mean. Then we subtract mean from each of the value. That will give us the deviation. Then we square the deviation. And that's what we are doing in the fourth column. After we square the deviation, that will be the deviation for each value. So if the value repeats 3 times, then we multiply by 3. So here, if it repeats 4 times, we multiply 17.64, which is the deviation square, or square of deviation. Then we multiply by the frequency, how many times it appears for. So if we know this value, then 145.4, then we can find the standard deviation, which will be the square root of 145.40 divided by 50.50 minus 1, which is again sample size. So this will be the conclusion of lecture on standard deviation. Also, how to find the variance and also how to find the range. The goal of these 3 items is to find how the data are spread, the variations in the data set. So again, thank you.